Well, today's topic is going to be probably a little bit of a controversial topic because it always is whenever it's brought up in discussions on Facebook or even on some of our past videos on YouTube. And that has to do with small segments. And over the next month or two, I'm going to actually do a few different videos about small segments to help people understand why the advice that people give them about small segments is probably what they should follow. And today's is one of those. In particular, I had a viewer that asked me if multiple small segments are evidence of a relationship. In other words, if we have a person that we can match many of these small segments that add up to like 30 centimorgans or more, that might show that it's a distance relationship. Is their theory from this? So let's delve into this in a little bit of detail. Now, first off, we need to understand what a small segment is. And in that case, we're talking about segments that are less than 7 centimorgans. Now, why even put this distinction between small segments and non-small segments, segments greater than 7 centimorgans? It all has to do with how DNA is inherited and the fact that, most of our DNA is the same. And even when we're talking about SNPs, most of the SNPs you have with any other random person are still the same, more than 50%. So it's really a tiny fraction of DNA that actually separates us out. And because of that, some segments may be false segments. Now, Tim Jansen and John Walden, several years ago, they did an analysis of thousands of segments and whether or not they were true segments or false segments. How they determined that is because they happen to have DNA from a child and the child's parents. Now, since the child inherited all the DNA from their two parents, then anything that matches the child but does not match one of the parents has to be a false segment. And they went through all this data and laid it out by segment size. And that's this table here from the ISOG Wiki website. And what you can see is that as segments are large, 15 centimorgans, they could match up 100% of those segments, whether they were just comparing it with one parent phased or with both sides phased. And both sides phased is the key one, because that's going to be the most accurate information. Going down to 10 centimorgans, you can still see we're almost at 90%, 86%. So there's about 14% total of your DNA segments that are false segments at 10 centimorgans, but still the majority of them are true segments. As we go down further to 7 centimorgans, what you see here is if we're just looking at one parent, only 63% of them are true segments, whereas if we are comparing with both parents, 42% of them are true, so just under 50%. And so I think this is why 7 centimorgans is a good cutoff. Some people use 8 centimorgans, but right around in this area of 7 to 8 centimorgans, you go from where the majority of your segments are true segments, in other words, they actually got passed down from your mother or father, to the majority are false segments. And as you can see, as we go down smaller and smaller, we get to more and more false segments faster. From 7 to 6, we go basically almost in half, from 42 down to 26. So only about a quarter of your 6 centimorgan segments are real segments. In other words, 3/4 of your time spent looking at 6 centimorgan segments is really going to be time wasted because they are not indicative of any kind of relationship. And as we go down to 3 centimorgans, at the very bottom, it is 1%. Now, if you want to look at this in a graph, that graph is also on the ISOG Wiki in the same article about identical by descent. And this is just the probability, and this is really just taking that same data from the table and plotting it on a graph. And you can see here that right around 8 centimorgans is where that 50% mark is, 7 to 8 centimorgans. And it goes down drastically from there. So small centimorgans means more false matches. All right, but what about lots of small centimorgans? Now, this viewer described how this match was found. First off, What they had is they had a distant relative that was identified through an ancestry tree. Hey, that's, fine. We've got our trees to meet up 6, 7, 8 generations ago. Now, there was no DNA match on Ancestry. This person had tested on Ancestry, and this relative had tested on Ancestry, but they didn't match each other when looking at their Ancestry DNA. They both uploaded to GEDmatch also, and there was no DNA match above 7 centimorgans on GEDmatch. So when they lowered that threshold down to 3 centimorgans, remember from the data I just showed you, 99% of the segments at 3 centimorgans are false segments. But when they lowered that to 3 centimorgans, they were showing 40 centimorgans total. So they had, 10, 12, 13, 14 or so segments that added up to about 40 centimorgans. Now, 40 centimorgans on GEDmatch could actually be a pretty good match. Maybe 4th or 5th cousins, possibly 3rd cousins. But 40 centimorgans is a good match to work with. And so the question is, since this small segments, it's not just one small segment, but it's a lot of small segments, and it adds up to a significant amount. And we know from our trees that we match, well, could we use this data or could we assume then that these small segments are through that ancestral line? Well, let's look at some other matches. And this is exactly what I told him. So start off with me and my wife. Now, if you have watched this channel for a while, you know that me and my wife are not related other than that we're married. And if we look at our DNA at more than 7 centimorgans, it shows us, hey, there are no DNA segments found. But what happens when we look at less than 7 centimorgans? Aha! We share, 31 centimorgans total in these 3 and 4 centimorgan segments. So me and my wife share basically about as much as this other person shared on this. Now, both me and my wife actually have fairly extensive family trees, and we can say for certainty that we're definitely, absolutely 100% not related in the last 5 generations. Okay, that's where some of our holes start to show up. But because of what we know about our heritage as far as, hey, where those holes are, hers go back to Germany, mine go back to England, we can safely assume that we're most likely not related within at least 10 generations or more. Now, her brother and I happen to share the same Y-DNA haplogroup. So you might be saying, well, see there, you have to be related. But that haplogroup also happens to be like the most common one in all of Europe. Millions upon millions of people have that haplogroup. We are probably not related at least for 5,000 years or so. But let's go a step further. Devon has a half aunt, so we can take away, 1/2 of the relationship there from one side here. And me and that half aunt, we share no DNA. If we're looking above 7 centimorgans. If we look above 3 centimorgans, we share 26.9 centimorgans of DNA, almost as much as me and Devon share, even though this half aunt, half of her DNA is completely not related to Devon's at all. So we're adding in some randomness here, and yet me and this person share about the same amount of DNA as me and my wife, who we know are not related in any kind of genealogical time frame. So let's go one step further. I'm going to use my cousin, who is only related to half of my family, and Devon's half aunt, who of course has only half of the DNA that shares with Devon, but you get the picture there. And 7 centimorgans above, yes, we share no DNA. We're not related. When we look at 3 centimorgans, they share 17 centimorgans of DNA. And it's not always the same DNA. So let's look at somebody even more not related to us, and this would be my cousin and Devon's sister-in-law. Now, what is special about Devon's sister-in-law, and we've used her DNA on this channel before, is she is from Mexico. And Mexico has a nice kaleidoscope of DNA from Europe, from Africa, and from Americas. Since my cousin's DNA is primarily from England and Europe, Devon's sister-in-law's DNA is primarily Native American, a little bit of European, and a little bit of Sub-Saharan African. So even less relationship between these two. And with less than 3 centimorgans, we see that they still share 6 centimorgans. Now, I know for certain from a genealogical time frame that these two, there is no records that are going to connect these two. One, because most of the European DNA that you find in Mexico is actually from Spain, Portugal area. Whereas my cousin, my family side, we are predominantly from England with, I'm not even sure that there is any. There might be some Spanish DNA from 500 years ago, but no place where there's records, no place that we're actually going to be able to connect with this sister-in-law. All right, so let me even go one step further. And I happen to have a friend who's African American, and from his DNA, it's predominantly African DNA, Sub-Saharan African DNA. Myself, I have no African DNA, except for the fact that, I'm human and all of our DNA originally in Africa. But from an ethnicity standpoint, from an admixture standpoint, you can see that my DNA is 100% European. Or 99% European. You can see that his DNA is, I think, something like 85% Sub-Saharan African and some European, but his is all mixed European. It's not just England European. With more than 7 centimorgans, we share no DNA. And finally, when we get to less than 3 centimorgans, me and this friend of mine, we also don't share any DNA. And that's probably because while we are related, because we're human, our nearest common ancestor most likely is 30,000 years ago, maybe 40,000 years ago or so. It's highly unlikely that we actually share a common ancestor much sooner than that. Now, perhaps with a little bit of European DNA that he has, we might have a common ancestor 1,000, 2,000 years ago. But in general, I would safely say that, yeah, we're probably, 320th cousins twice removed. And that's why you're not seeing any kind of DNA at all. In essence, the answer to this question, do a bunch of small segments show evidence of being related? I'm going to say categorically no. And in this case, it's because we're talking about a genealogical time frame. In other words, a relationship that we can show through other records exists. We're all related as far as humans. It's just a matter of how far back you want to go. Like with me and my friend, who our nearest ancestors probably 40,000 years ago. Yeah, we're related, but just in the sense that we're all human, not in the sense that, oh yeah, we're going to be at a family reunion together. One of the things I think you'll find is if you take any 2 random people, there's a decent likelihood that you actually share some DNA with these small segments. And in some cases, you might share 30 or 40 or even 50 centimorgans of DNA when you add up all of these small segments. Lots of small segments do not indicate a genealogical relationship that you're going to be able to show through other documents. Now, if you have any comments about small segments, be sure to put it in the comments below, because there's always comments about small segments. Be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. And if you'd like to join FHF Extra, it's only $2.99 a month, and it helps us to provide more content for you that is just for members. If you'd like to watch something else, then you can watch this video up above.